Hi there, and welcome to the Clarke Museum. We are very, very happy to have started our Saturday speakers events again, and we're very pleased to have with us Carla Baku, who has written the novel, and I'm going to grab this from you so I can show it. Chasing Down the Moon, which is a fictionalized account of things leading up to the 1885 Chinese Expulsion here in Eureka. It's a really wonderful book. As I said, it's fiction, but there's so much research and rich history in this book. If you have not read it, I strongly suggest you get yourself a copy, and you can probably get Carla to sign it for you. So anyway, without further ado, let me present Carla.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad for any of you who tuned in today to see what we're going to talk about. And what I usually do when I talk about this book is sort of go back and give a retrospective about why me and why this book. I grew up in Eureka. I went all the way from kindergarten to 12th grade in Eureka City schools, and never once did I hear the slightest hint that Eureka had once had its own Chinatown. I didn't find that information out until I was in my 30s and living in San Diego. And I happened upon Ray Raphael's wonderful history book about Humboldt County called An Everyday History of Somewhere. And I was so thrilled. I was at my little local public library, always very homesick for Eureka, and found his book on the shelf, grabbed it up, took it home, started reading from page 1, and I got about halfway in and read this. It's basically one page of information telling about how Eureka had a Chinatown, and that there was an incident in which a Eureka City councilman was accidentally shot and killed, and within 48 hours, the entire population of Eureka's Chinese were on steamships and sent out to sea to go to San Francisco. And I remember being utterly stunned that that was a thing. I couldn't understand how I could not have learned about it in school. And I hadn't even so much as overheard a conversation as I was growing up among all the generations of my family who lived here and all the other adults that I was exposed to. So a seed got lodged for me that day. It never left my mind that this rich culture that was part and becoming part of Eureka's story was just wiped out. And I knew that I wanted to write something about that. So obviously what I did is sit right down and write the book. That's not true. I didn't write the book for another 20 years. But I think for me to be the correct writer for this book, I needed more time under my belt, and I needed the circumstances that came to be for me, and that was the opportunity to go to Stanford as a 50-year-old undergraduate and get involved in their creative writing program with wonderful teachers. And it wasn't just Stanford and it wasn't just the teachers, but the students that I was with. There were, in my creative writing classes, I had a lot of Asian American young women, and they acted as wonderful voices for helping me with some of the things that I felt like I don't know that I'm the person to write this story. The hardest scenes for me to write were the scenes taking place in the 1880s in China. It's easy enough to research life in a Victorian United States, but it's many more steps removed to know what is village life like in 1883 in the hills of Hunan. I had no idea. So those felt like the most sacred scenes that I needed to be as careful as I could be when I was writing them. The other part that is very difficult with the writing of this book, and really any book, was the fact that this is a history that contains tremendous human hardship and brutality. And writing brutality is a very fearsome responsibility, because there's a terrible fine line between saying enough that you honor the people who were brutalized, but not lingering in the wrong places in such a way that is exploitative. So that was also some difficult time with writing it. But what I did is, it was finally time, and I was given the opportunity to work with another writer, and she said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to write a book, I want to write a novel, and I want this experience that these people had as my backdrop." And she said, "Okay." And that's when I learned that there's nobody to give you permission to write a book. There's no, committee that you have to go to. It's just, if you're going to do it, you have to do it. So I had absolutely no idea what form the book was supposed to take. So I just started writing scenes, and I had a picture in my mind of, there's a scene where I think I could argue the primary protagonist, Yazhen, young woman who ends up here in Eureka in my story. I had a picture of her in a Victorian hotel room about to take a bath. And just that little sort of picture in my head, I thought, okay, well, I'll write that scene. And then I wrote another scene and another scene with no idea how they were supposed to fit together. I was not a plotter at that point in my writing. And then as more and more scenes came up, the sort of the hint of what the arc of the story was supposed to be took place. I got some great feedback, as I said, from some of my classmates. One of the first scenes in the book, not the prelude, but chapter 1, takes place in the hills of Hunan, and it is this young girl, Yazhen, and she and her family are going through a time of terrible deprivation and hunger. And, one of my classmates talked to me about chicken being something that would be saved for a special dinner. And so I'll just read that little bit. And I very much thanked my classmate for giving me this notion. This is chapter 1, and it says, "The starving time. Each spring, this is what the people in the village called the lean months, when the best mushrooms were gone from the woods and spring greens had not yet come up. Yazhen was 16, a slender girl, tall like her father. Her hands and arms were strongly corded from a great deal of physical work. Today, she huddled under a blanket, trying to keep her small brother distracted so he would stop complaining of hunger. She could not stop thinking about an egg, how the yellow yolk would coat her tongue. But the last hen had stopped laying and gone into the pot long ago, feeding them, first with parceled bits of flesh, then smoky traces of marrow, and finally broth, diluted a little more each day until it was a sip of hot water infused with the memory of chicken. So there's no way to write Ya Zhen's story. She is sold into human trafficking by her family because of their poverty. And her story is based on a compilation of study done about women who were indeed trafficked during that time and the way they had to live and survive being trafficked, particularly through the ports of San Francisco and in other places on the West Coast. And it's a brutal story, but my hope was to make it be a living story based on her being here at the time when this incident took place. So when we're here in Eureka, was there a brothel that had Chinese prostitutes in it? We don't know. There's no actual record that I have found or have heard from anyone else. The probability is there. There were very, very few Chinese women here then, and that was pretty common because women had been prevented from immigrating by the Chinese Exclusion Act. So a lot of men who were already here working on railroads, working in mines and so forth, who were working to support families back in China, probably some of them hoping to bring family here, were suddenly, all by themselves. And so sadly, most of the Chinese women who were here were forced into the slavery of the day. And so that was her story that I wanted to tell. But I wanted to also have it be part of the bigger story of what happened here in February 1885. The trouble with trying to tell a story about the Chinese expulsion is that it's an incident. It's an incident that happened in a discrete period of time over really just a couple of days, the acute part of the incident. And that's not a story. That's a thing that happened. And when we read stories, we read to find out, what did that mean for humans? What did that mean for people who feel the way I feel and think the way I think? What kind of an impact would that have had on the people who lived here? I also wanted to delve a little bit into some of the real characters who lived here in Eureka, the real people like David Kendall, the councilman who died, and the current sheriff at the time, and the minister who lived here. Those were real people, and there are real records about some of the ways that they were involved. But then you have to bring your fictional story and melt it together with the thing that really happened, and still give, not overwrite the incident of the expulsion, or fictionalize it so much that it's not true to to what happened. So that was a fun bit of research. I learned a lot about some of the people who were actually living here. I found it shocking, I guess, that there wasn't a lot more physical violence perpetrated on the Chinese during those 48 hours. I'm certain that there were probably one-on-one things that happened during those hours that, you know, it's not written down historically anywhere, but there was a mob scene when and it happened very quickly when David Kendall was shot, and you know, a gallows was built, and it's really kind of amazing that the only thing hung on the gallows was the minister being hung in effigy because he was a supporter of the Chinese community. There weren't actually any Chinese people put on the gallows and hung, thankfully. So that was a surprising thing to me, and I wanted to have a little mystery in the book. There is I create a little sub-story in the book that lets your imagination say, well, what if the councilman wasn't shot by rivaling Chinese gangs? What if that isn't what happened? It probably is what happened. The papers record that there was a lot of gun violence going on in Chinatown and around Chinatown, but they never arrested anyone for the shooting. And I would have thought in that era especially, they would have found someone to blame it on if they could have, and they didn't. So I think that's an interesting little historical tidbit. And so I create an alternate reality that maybe somebody else shot Councilman Kendall, but things can light a fuse and then have terrible repercussions no matter who lit the fuse. So I've got a lot of real people that I have imagined a life for, and I've got a lot of fictional characters who get put into the story, and then the expulsion is sort of this explosion that happens to the entire town in my book. So that's the background and sort of how I went about it. And I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything they wonder about. Yeah.
Two things. One, just because I forgot to read your bio, and I was going to do that when I introduced you. Could you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Sure. So I grew up here, like I said, and moved away, like most of us who grew up here, especially then, moved away to the real world when I was about 21 and lived in Southern California, and lived there until 1995, which is when I moved back. So after I moved back is when I decided I wanted to go back to school, and I started going to CR and kind of just did a class at a time. And you know, back then you could go forever if you wanted to, and I took every class that interested me. And then finally, after 10 or 11 years, I decided, my kids are starting to go to college now. I should probably finish this up. And so I signed up for the last 2 classes I needed for my general ed. And that's when I heard about a particular scholarship. I was encouraged to apply for it. And the scholarship said, apply to your dream schools. Well, for me, as a 50-year-old woman, my dream school had to be within driving distance of my home. And so really as a lark, I applied to HSU, California College of the Arts, and Stanford as and they all told me I could come, and I won the scholarship too. So if you get accepted to Stanford, it's just sort of like, yeah, I'm probably gonna have to go to Stanford. So I drove up and down the highway every couple of weeks, would come home for 3 days, and my wonderful husband was 100% my cheerleader and held down the fort and fed the cat and all that. And so I did that and graduated from there in 2 years, came back. I was the executive director of Humboldt Literacy Project for a while, and then I went and got my MFA at Warren Wilson MFA program. So, I taught for a little while at CR. I taught English, but mostly I've just been, since then, working at home in my little home office. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What was your source material? Where did you get most of your information?
Oh gosh, so I had the Humboldt Historical Society, and they've got, it was a treasure trove, love it. So I spent a lot of hours there, and they were so wonderfully helpful, not just with the old newspaper articles and things like that, but also with just pictures and things like that. I did get some great input from a professor at Stanford who teaches Chinese history. He kind of pointed me in the direction of some books and things that helped. Gene Falzer's book, Professor Falzer's book, Driven Out, was wonderful. And that came out right at the time when I was getting ready to start this book. So that was really nice because she was here at the time, and she focused so specifically on what happened here, the Eureka method as it came to be known. And a lot of books about everyday life in the Victorian era, because it's the little details that as you read, it's sort of throwaway details that you don't notice, but if you get them wrong, even like idioms and turns of phrase and things like that, there are things that you think, well, people have been saying that forever, but then you find out, no, they didn't start saying that until, the 1930s or something like that. So it's all those little details. So I have a big shelf of books at home for all those kinds of things. So there was also a lady, and I'm blanking on her name. The English name she took on was Polly, and she's a lady who was an indentured prostitute in San Francisco when she first got here, but she gained her own freedom and became a very successful businesswoman, sort of inland California, like running I think a hotel and an eatery, and so I really wanted to take some of the inspiration of her story, and there were some underground, essentially underground railroad situations going on where people were helping women get out of that horrendous lifestyle, and so I wanted to borrow from that idea. Like I said, I started writing it in 2008. That's quite a while ago. I don't know if I were writing this book today, I don't know if this is the book exactly that I'd be writing. There are some things that I think I would do differently, even though, yes, there were people in Eureka who were helping. They were friends in the they were supportive of the Chinese community, but there is an argument to be made that the white culture is too central in this story. I think I would write this book somewhat differently if I wrote it now. But this is the book I wrote then and conceived of then, and tried to do my best to honor the fact that this is really somebody else's story. So, yeah. Any other? Yes, sir.
So here we are in the 1880s in Eureka.
Right.
And great deal of activity, great deal of economic growth, great deal of commerce
Mm-hmm.
in Eureka. But we're also less than 20 years away from the end of the Civil War.
Absolutely.
And all of the tumult that occurred nationwide, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of activities, Civil War period here in terms of the Native Americans and
Yep.
white settlers, and then we had a tremendous number of Civil War veterans who came to Humboldt County
Mm-hmm.
after the Civil War
Mm-hmm.
from all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do you think, could your crystal ball say, in terms of how some of those things might have influenced the reaction and might have influenced the climate
Right.
here?
Right.
And I'm thinking that, it's a period where a lot of people wanted to put the past behind them,
Mm-hmm.
looking forward to the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would think there was a lot of acceptance or a lot of want
Mm-hmm.
to kind of make things black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Here we've got a situation, a tragic situation that happened, and here's our opportunity to clean this up.
Right.
Get on with things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
thoughts.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that so you had a multitude of factors clashing, right, in that historical moment. So you had, as you say, people who had come here from elsewhere, and at that time, Eureka was a super young town as far as the Anglo community, right? So. It was still very much, it was about 30 years old. So in greater terms, it was a young, Wild West situation. You would have a lot of single men who were in the woods, they were fishermen, they were working on railroads, they were miners. There was still a lot of miners in this area at the time. So you had all that, and we know that during that time the brothel situation was huge, as it would be in a sort of a situation where you've got a heavy male population, a lot of single men especially. So there's a fuse to be lit, and you've got. I think with the Chinese specifically, the rhetoric in California, it was in the rest of the nation too, but California and the West Coast, the anti-Chinese rhetoric was just massive. It was so outrageous and vicious that I think that's a really good take, that the response would be like, no, we will not have that here. We will erase this out of our midst and move on and go forward And that'll work better for us because we're just going to take these people away and subtract them from the circumstances. So, you know, when you read the newspaper articles and stuff that were going on daily in the local papers days prior to this happening, it's almost eerie. It's almost like, you know, days before Kendall was shot, it was, you know, there was this shooting in you know, a Chinaman, sorry for using the word, but that's what it read in the paper, was killed. And if ever an unoffending white man is shot, you know, essentially they'll be hell to pay. And it was just within hours almost that's exactly what happened. So everybody was primed for the worst thing. And what do you do then? You say, you know, we have found our scapegoat. It's the whole population. What a great idea. We happen to have these 2 steamships, which was very rare. It was because there had been storms in the area during the weeks prior, but there were 2 ships in port, problem solved. I think your idea of wanting to just say, you know, okay, you know, we've dealt with our problems. Let's just make a clean slate of this. That's a really good point. Any other questions? Yeah.
Without spoilers, and also I'm fascinated by the fact that you said that you were a pantser at this time because the plot weaves together so nicely, but did you at any point consider any other outcomes for any of the characters other than what happened? And again, I don't want to give any spoilers, so I'm not going to say if it's good, bad, or indifferent, but
Okay.
I'm very curious.
Yeah.
The tension that was built, I had to put it down for a couple of days because
Oh,
I
yeah.
was like really worried that one of my favorite characters
Something bad's going to happen. Yeah, actually, there were a couple of different ideas. One of the female characters, Rose, she was going to have a very different outcome in the story as I originally envisioned it. I don't know if that's who you're talking about, but that situation in the book was going to end very differently. The relationships between the main characters were pretty different in some earlier versions of the story, and the very ending of the book, which takes place out of the area, that was not the original ending. And I thought the book was finished, sort of at that, what is now the penultimate moment in the book was it was the end, having to do with the ships and so forth. That it was several days later that I couldn't stop thinking about the character I focused on at the very end, and that this wasn't just her story, but it was primarily her story. And I wanted to bring her story much more full circle than I had left it off. And I think of all the scenes in the book, as I wrote it, but I could read that scene over and over. I get emotional about it. So yeah, I was definitely, you know, like, you're a writer. So when we say pantser, we mean you write by the seat of your pants as you go along instead of plotting. It takes a lot more time because there's a lot of that thinking, well, the next thing that should happen is this, and writing chapters and then realizing this doesn't even fit in the book I'm trying to write. So I do a lot more plotting with the writing I do now. It just makes it a lot easier in the long run.
Sadly, I have to agree.
Yeah. There's some magic in writing by the seat of your pants. You know, you're discovering it as you go along, and you do anyway, even if you plot. But there's like that safety in a roadmap for knowing what you're writing next. You know, so yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Would you ever consider maybe not continuing this book, but doing an offshoot of writing something similar?
You know, you're not the first person to ask me that. And the first time I did get asked that, it came as sort of a surprise. Because it was like, well, this is a standalone book, you know, the story's over, sorry. And I've thought, what would that be, you know? Like, so I haven't really I haven't sat down and thought, you know, like plotted anything out. But I have thought about, like, what if those characters, you know, who were with us at the end, like, what if we continued that sort of story into, you know, the new century, you know, from the 1900s or something like that. And I've thought about doing maybe some other historical fiction about our area, because goodness knows there's a lot of stories to be told. And the thing that I love about fiction is that you can tell those stories in a really, in a way that sinks right into the heart. We can be very affected by reading nonfiction and, you know, the history of things. But there's something about bringing that moment to life for a human being that you're creating on the page that I think, that's why we love to read, and that's why we love to watch films and, you know, other content that brings history into a form that feels really immediate. So yeah, it's kind of crossed my mind, but like I'm still sort of thinking, I'm not really sure what that should look like. So yeah. Well, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. All right.